Want to learn about Genesis? Cool, let's learn about Genesis. I am Jason, and this is an introduction to the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. I hope you enjoy. This is the first in a series of introductions that I'm going to be doing for the books of the Bible. Now, we can't talk about everything in the book, obviously. That would be very difficult. But what we can do is answer some familiar questions. For instance, who wrote the book? When was it written? Why was it written? Who was it written to? Where it was written from? And where the people were that were reading it for the first time? Those are all questions that we can ask that help us get our way into the understandings of the books of the Bible. The other thing we'll do is look at the structure. So for instance, we'll talk about Genesis 1 through 11 as opposed to 12 through 50. Those are two different distinct blocks of scripture that we'll look at in the book of Genesis. And then once we do that, we can ask some other questions. Are there themes of the book that we need to look for? Are there particular snippets of the book that help us understand the whole? These are all questions that we ask for two reasons. One, it might help us as we read the book for the first time, or if we've read that particular book before, then the benefit is we might see something that we've never seen before as we've read it. You know, a great movie, if you watch it for the 10th time, you see something new, right? The Bible's the same way. So we'll just be given some sort of introductory things, and that way you can take it and you can read more of the book by yourself. And that brings up a great question. Why do we read the Bible? Why do we study it? And that's actually a pretty great question that has a pretty easy answer. And it's this. The Bible is the revelation of who God is. It's the history of God's people recognizing God in the world. And so as we read the Bible, God is revealed to us. That's a really big benefit for a couple of ways. First, as we live in the world, we can see God. We can recognize God working in the world because we've seen how God has worked in the past in the scripture. And it also, the second thing is, helps us to not misrecognize God. The last thing we want to do is call something godly that's not. And so our ability to go into the world and see through where people say, hey, this is God or that is God, we can see much better because we have this history of knowing Scripture. So the study of Scripture is incredibly important for our ability to see God as God works through this world. Here we go then, the book of Genesis. Now, Genesis in Greek means the beginning, and this is the beginning story of God's people, the beginning story of God's creation, however you want to term that. But it's also the beginning of the first 5 books of the Bible, which is called the Torah. This is the original 5 books of the Hebrew Scripture. It's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And these form the basis of who the Hebrew people were and give us a basis for who we are. Now, you might have heard this Torah, these 5 books, called the law, and that's probably an unfortunate translation because maybe a better translation would be teachings or guidance, because it is a guidance in how to live in community with each other. You might have also heard it called the Pentateuch. That's the first 5 books as translated as the scrolls. But regardless, Genesis is the first of the books in either the Torah or the Pentateuch, whichever one that you've heard it. And it gives us a basis for who we are as God's people. All right, that brings us to the who, what, where, when, and why questions. And we'll start with the who question. Who wrote the book of Genesis? And I can't really answer that. I don't know. It most assuredly wasn't Moses. Moses was very busy at the time, wandering around in the desert and trying to lead a bunch of people. So though we traditionally attribute the book to Moses, it probably wasn't him. It was somebody else or some other people. But maybe there are some other questions we can ask that help us answer the who wrote it question. So we'll look at some more questions instead. Like, who was it written to? That's a good question that we can ask. And the answer to that is, it was written to other Jewish people. It was written by the Jews for the Jews to explain theologically who they are. Why are we here? What are we doing here? What's our purpose for being here? All questions that we all ask in this world, right? Well, these 5 books, and Genesis included, were written to other Jews to answer some of those questions. Now, what's interesting in that is that today, Christians have somewhat of a difficulty in maybe connecting to parts of the Genesis story. For instance, it's hard for us to connect to the Abraham story and the promise of the land in Israel and some of those things. And what Christians have done then is take particular parts of Genesis story and really apply those in an extra effort in our faith. For instance, we take the fall story incredibly seriously in the book of Genesis. maybe some of the other stories not quite as much. The fall story becomes important to us. So maybe one of the ways that we can then look at the book or read it with fresh eyes is to recognize the original audience, knowing it was written by Jews and for Jews. So as you read this book then, remember who it was written to originally. It was written to Jewish people trying to find an understanding of who they are. And as we read it that way, we might pick up some new things that we haven't seen before. So another question we can ask is, when was it written? And that's a very interesting question because it's not quite as old as we might think it is. It was probably written in the 5th or 6th century BC as a response to the Babylonian exile. If you don't know about the Babylonian exile, you need to. It's the basis for almost everything that's in Scripture, it seems like, and you can read a little bit more about it. I'll put a link to it here. But in essence, it was this. In 587 BC, the Babylonians showed up to Jerusalem and they were very angry that Jerusalem hadn't been paying the tribute that Babylon thought they should have paid. So when they showed up, they tore the temple apart brick by brick. They destroyed large portions of Jerusalem and other of the surrounding area. And in the process, they took all the leadership of Jerusalem and they took them to Babylon as exiles. For 40 years, the leadership lived in exile in Babylon. And when they returned via Cyrus and the Persians, who became the next power in the world, when they came back, they started writing down who they are because they needed to remember what happened in this time, explain what happened. So they started writing down the stories and developing a theology based on what occurred, that we lost the temple, we lost Jerusalem, we lost all of this for this extended period of time. So when was it written? It was probably written 5th or 6th century BC in a response to the Babylonian exile. Okay, the next question then that we can ask is, how is the book divided up? And that's a pretty interesting answer too, and very valuable for our reading. The first section is chapter 1 through chapter 11, and these are the prehistory stories. It's the story of creation through the story of Noah. And there's a couple of things to notice as you read these first 11 chapters. The first thing is this. There are 2 creation stories, which I think is just magnificent. The first creation story is in chapter 1 and the first couple of 3 verses of chapter 2. And then the second creation story is the rest of chapter 2. There are some stunning differences in the two. For instance, the name of God is different. In chapter 1, it's Elohim, which is God. In chapter 2, it's Yahweh, which is the Lord. The order of creation is different, and even the manner in which God creates is different. In the first story, God speaks things into existence, and in the second story, God forms things into existence and breathes the breath of life into Adam's lungs, and some really interesting things like that. So you'll recognize those differences because these 2 stories come through different traditions in the Jewish faith, but are combined here, put together here to get a full understanding of who God is. And I just think that's an amazing way to put the book together. Now, the second thing you might take out of this prehistory section, this 1 through 11, is that the Noah story climaxes at God's promise that this will never happen again, and that promise is to all people. So as you read that section, recognize the build up to that moment that God promises all creation that God will form a covenant. Now, we're going to watch that narrow down for a while to the Jewish people through Abraham, but from the beginning of the book, we recognize that the promise really is eventually to all people, which, thank God, includes you and me. And the third thing that I always like to ask when I read this section is, what was the snake doing in the garden in the first place? Wasn't that Eden? What's a snake doing there? The second section then is chapter 12 through chapter 50, and these are the Abraham descendant stories. These are the covenant stories. Now it begins with Sarah and Abraham in Ur, and they are called to go to the promised land, and in doing so are promised that the descendants of Abraham will be as many as the stars, which causes Sarah to bust out laughing, of course, because she's past her child-rearing years. But nonetheless, that is the covenant, and so they leave Ur and start traveling west. Now, some things to notice in this story is that this leads us up to the Exodus story. As we learn of all the descendants, they end up in Egypt, and that leads directly into the captivity that we see there. Another thing to notice as we read this story is this. Look at how many times the people of the covenant put the covenant in jeopardy. And then watch and see how God fulfills that covenant anyway, that God makes sure that that covenant is fulfilled regardless of how the covenant is put in jeopardy. So it's very interesting to look at that based on look how many times we put the covenant with God in jeopardy, and yet God is always fulfilling the covenant with us too. And here's the last thing about Genesis that I think we need to look at. There are some really, really difficult stories in the book of Genesis. For instance, there is the story of Jericho, which is a genocidal story. It's awful. There's the story of the binding of Isaac, Abraham taking Isaac up the mountain, and that's really a difficult story. If you can imagine being the other parent, can you imagine being the mother, Sarah, in this situation when she hears of what happened? All of these are very, very challenging stories. If you want to look at an interesting take, by the way, on the binding of Isaac, look at what I'm linking here. It's Jaha Zainabu in a poem called Dear Isaac, and it's fascinating in how it twists our vision just a little bit to see what else we can find in these very difficult stories. And that's what I hope you do. As you're reading it, recognize these stories sometimes can be very tough, and asking ourselves difficult questions and figuring out how we apply these stories to our faith or don't apply them to our faith are very important questions to ask as we try to find out how we can see God through them. That leads us to the last couple of things I want to talk about as we read the Bible in general. And the first one is this. I'm becoming increasingly aware of how important it is not to attach meanings to things that we think we already have the meaning of. Now, I recognize that part of living and part of learning is starting to attach meanings to things pretty quickly. But if we're careful about doing that, sometimes we'll recognize that there's maybe more to a story or more to a thought or more to a word than what we have attached to it in the past. So as you're reading it, think about how are we attaching meanings to things, and are we sure that those meanings are right? I'll give you an example. Many of us, if we talk about Sodom, start recognizing some meanings that we attach to it immediately. But do we attach Ezekiel's meaning? I'm going to have you look that up on your own and research it on your own. Maybe Google Ezekiel and Sodom, and you'll learn a little bit more of how Ezekiel identified the problem at Sodom, and it's not the way that we identify at times today. So that's just one way of describing how we put meanings to things that sometimes we need to back up and make sure that we are giving the meanings that it deserves or that is authentic to the scriptures. So one of the ways you can do that is by doing research. Now, don't go on the internet just looking for stuff, because there is a lot of horrible, horrible things on the internet that don't explain scripture as we need it explained to us. There are some very challenged explanations there. But Wikipedia sometimes is a fantastic place. And so do good research. Let me know some of the questions and we can answer them together and research them together. And that leads me to my second point, which is this. As we read the scriptures, it is not a solo effort. The faith isn't a solo effort. This is a communal effort, and reading scripture is communal. That's the way it was done in the past. One would read and then they would talk about it or have it explained in the synagogues or in the Christian homes or wherever. And today is no different than that. As we read the scriptures, make sure you're in community with someone, talking with them, reading together, or just hashing it out. I'd love to be that person. I'm an absolute geek for this kind of stuff. So if you want to talk to me, that's great. But make sure you're talking it through with someone, because this Bible is fantastic. This book of Genesis is fantastic. And to be able to share it with each other and talk through it with each other is one of the beautiful things of Scripture. So enjoy your reading of Genesis. Let me know if I can help in any way. And then we'll come back next time for Exodus. God bless.